Next question is judicial restraint. So, the introduction for this is that judicial restraint emphasizes limited judicial intervention, focuses on deferring to the legislature, advocates respect for separation of powers, judges avoid legislating from the bench, courts act as interpreters of law, ensures judicial respect for democracy, judicial restraint promotes legal stability, restraint aligns with constitutional values, encourages respect for elected officials, judges avoid overreach into policy, prioritizes adherence to legal precedents, restrain judicial intervention in executive actions, judges interpret, not create laws, restraint maintains separation of powers, discourages judicial activism or intervention, encourages careful exercise of judicial power, focus on protecting individual rights, a balance between law and politics, preserves the independence of judiciary, vital for constitutional democracy health. Types of judicial restraint: textual interpretation, strict adherence to law text, deference to legislative intent, respecting lawmakers' intentions in laws, avoidance of political questions, resisting political issue involvement, respect for precedent, following established legal precedents, minimal judicial intervention, courts limit their decision making, non interference in executive affairs, courts refrain from executive decisions, separation of powers, maintaining judicial limits on other branches, conservatism in judicial review, courts avoid unnecessary constitutional challenges, deference to local laws, respect for state law authority, limited review of social issues, resisting involvement in societal matters, avoidance of legal activism, prevents judicially created policy changes, focus on fundamental rights, resisting expansive interpretations beyond rights, case specific judgments, limited rulings based on facts, avoiding overreaching in national interest, courts avoid excessive intervention in national governance, reluctance in criminal justice, courts avoid revisiting criminal law statutes, limited public policy determination, courts defer to legislative choices, judicial economy, avoiding unnecessary judicial proceedings, adherence to constitutional limits, courts follow constitutional restrictions strictly, restrain in discretionary powers, limited exercise of judicial discretion, cautions use of injunctions, minimal use of court orders. Important case law: Kesarvananda Bharti versus State of Kerala 1973, landmark case on judicial restraint, concerned the basic structural doctrine, established limits of parliamentary power, court refrained from striking down laws, focused on protecting constitutional framework, preserved the democratic process intact, limited judicial interference in amendments, prioritized stability of constitutional structure, judicial restraint in constitutional amendments, emphasized separation of powers, court upheld fundamental rights supremacy, balanced legislative action with judicial review, reaffirmed the importance of precedent, prevented judicial overreach in governance, court recognized the limits of review, distinguished between judicial review and activism, strengthened judiciary role as interpreter, impacted future judicial restraint practices, court avoided expanding basic structure, kept constitutional amendments under check. Minerva Mills Limited versus UOI 1980 involved judicial review of constitutional amendments focused on the basic structure. Court exercised restraint and judgment, limited judicial intervention in constitutional matters, balanced between fundamental rights and amendments, ensured legislative supremacy in lawmaking. Court preserved stability in governance, emphasized restraint in public policy. Judicial review was cautiously exercised, maintained clear boundaries for judiciary, upheld rights but minimized intervention, kept checks on parliament's power, refused to strike down amendment, balanced rights with legislative authority, avoided creating constitutional changes judicially, kept the rule of law intact, supported the constitutional foundational principles, focused on preventing judicial overreach. Court emphasized limited constitutional interpretation, reinforced importance of judicial restraint. Third case is S.R. Bommai versus UOI 1994 concerned dissolution of state assemblies. Court avoided broad interference in politics, focused on constitutional interpretation limits, ensured deference to the president's discretion, cautiously interpreted Article 356 provisions, restraint on judicial interventions in politics, upheld executive decision making authority. Court respected elected representatives' power, emphasized limited judicial involvement in governance. Court refused to override executive actions, ensured compliance with constitutional safeguards, emphasized constitutional limits on judicial review. Court rejected expansive judicial activism. Court balanced federalism with executive power. Judicial restraint prevented political overreach, avoided disrupting federal relations and balance, ensured executive power remains respected, reaffirmed separation of powers concept, focused on narrow interpretation of provisions, reinforced minimal interference in political questions. Conclusion: judicial restraint preserves democracy and balance, prevents judicial overreach into policy, protects the independence of judiciary, promotes respect for separation of powers, maintains checks on executive actions. Courts uphold constitutional frameworks, integrity, preserves stability in legal processes, reinforces legislative supremacy in decision making, ensures a clear judicial role, prevents courts from becoming policymakers, encourages cautious and measured rulings, avoids disruptive judicial interference in politics, focuses on protecting fundamental rights. Courts act within constitutional limits, ensures judicial intervention is justified, maintains judicial credibility and impartiality, protects fundamental rights, not overreach, establishes clear limits to judicial review, promotes stability in governance structures, a vital principle for democracy.